everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unsubscribe, the Demand Drive podcast. I am your host, AJ Alonso, and today I'm joined by a co-host. Excited to have Alex Ellison with me on the podcast today. Alex, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here. Excited to get introduced right off the bat.
Really going to twist that knife. Good listeners of the show will know. They'll get it. If you know, you know. But Alex, we are joined by a lovely guest today, Mr. Henry Shapiro over at Reclaim.ai, here to talk about some time management techniques and tactics for salespeople. Henry, how are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you here. We talk about time management a lot from a sales and marketing point of view, but it's good to have someone on who actually knows more about the processes and systems behind creating a good time management process for individuals to talk a little bit more systematically and scientifically, I would say, about the whole thing than myself and Alex, who just have our own experiences to pull from. So we're excited to have you here and have you talk about that. But before we jump into any of the questions that we have for you, let's hear a little bit more about you. Who is Henry Shapiro?
It's Henry Shapiro. Again, thanks for having me. Let's see. I'll start from maybe the point where I came to Portland, which is where I've kind of spent most of my career. I grew up on the East Coast and came out here for college many moons ago. It feels, and I started as I kind of fell into tech. I was actually a history major, and actually in a particular realm of history that is about as far away as you could imagine from tech. My specialty was around 19th century imperial Chinese history. So I wrote my senior thesis on opium suppression policy around the Opium War in the 18th and 19th century. Sort of realized, I think, through a variety of mechanisms, including the financial crisis, which was still in full swing when I graduated, that I didn't actually want to go down the road of academia. And I'd been working with a number of friends in college on building mostly internal programs for the college, and sort of working on different types of little mini projects on the side, particularly around actually cryptocurrency back when Bitcoin was $20 asset. Yeah, I unfortunately sold mine well before I wouldn't be talking to you right now. I'd be on an island somewhere else. Really developed a love of tech, and I mean, I kind of came in with a love of it, all those years ago. But my first job was really a lot of basically UX testing, QA. I was in a couple different startups doing 15 different jobs, and found my way into product management, which led me to a company called New Relic, which is where I was for about 5 years, from pre-IPO up till I think we were at almost 2,000 employees when I left. And then Patrick, my co-founder and the CEO of Reclaim, was actually my boss and then my peer later on in the history of the company. And we worked together for many years on a bunch of different features and products and customer initiatives, and realized we loved working with one another, and had this idea that was kind of rattling around in our heads for a good long time. And that's what inspired us to go out and quit our jobs and really start Reclaim.
Very cool.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. And as a fellow history major, I totally get, academia seems well and good, and then you sort of hit some things in the real world.
And then you get into academia and you realize oh man, if it's more of this shit, I'm not sure I'm signing up for this.
Yeah, I've made a huge mistake.
My retirement dream is still to go back and teach at my high school, but that's a whole separate story.
We'll save that for another episode.
Yeah.
But awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate that background and context. So yeah, let's dive into a little bit. Let's start with maybe sort of a quick recap of what Reclaim.ai is. What does it functionally do? Why did you build it, and sort of what are its goals?
Yeah. I'll kind of start. I'll answer that question backwards, because I think there's a lot in how we design the product functionally that kind of fits a philosophy and a problem statement that I think is a little different than some of the other folks who've entered this space recently. And I'm sure you've seen and kind of heard of a number of these other tools out there that do a mixture of time blocking and scheduling. Patrick and I, as I mentioned, were at New Relic, and we became kind of obsessed with this idea in our last couple of years there. And originally it was through the lens very much of we built, New Relic was a monitoring developer tooling kind of company. And so it was all through the lens of nerdy developer workflows, but we were really obsessed with this idea of like, how do organizations, especially as they get larger, make sure that they're still focused on the right priorities? And how do people in those organizations, as their schedules get busier and the number of dots that have to be connected just to get really simple stuff done kind of grows and grows and grows, how do they stay focused on their priorities without burning out? And originally, we were really thinking about an idea that had nothing to do with the calendar. Our first prototypes were things like, let's do things like instrument GitHub and try to understand like what the commit velocity of the team is and how long code review is taking, and are the CI/CD tools breaking down? And we showed it to a whole bunch of folks who we thought of as sort of colleagues, frontline managers, engineering managers, product managers, people in sort of the product org. And their response was just a very overwhelming meh. They were just like, yeah, this is cool data. I haven't seen this data before, but I've got every type of agile process you can imagine. I've got every type of monitoring tool and database tool and dev tool you could imagine, and none of it is solving my central problem. And we sort of poked on that and we're like, well, why? Like, what would make it solve that problem? And people kept coming back to time. They kept coming back to this thing of like, well, my best performing teams are the ones where the manager and the designer and the product manager are like spending time with the team, clear on their priorities, and really dedicating the work to like iterating through a tough problem. And also my best performing managers, my best performing engineers are the ones who are really intentional about managing their own time. And so we started kind of thinking more about like, yeah, there's this whole kind of world around the calendar, this whole, not only set of data, but also this like totally unautomated space that actually determines a lot of our destiny, not only like personally and professionally, but like in a corporate setting. Like you can watch as corporations get bigger, their calendars look shittier and shittier.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that sort of really turned a light bulb on for us, and where we really started looking seriously at the calendar. And I think part of the reason we ended up solving this problem a little differently is we didn't start from the question of how would we build a better calendar, or, the calendar sucks, let's make it better. We really started by asking this question that had more to do with like, how do we make people more intentional about how they use their time across work and life? And so, functionally what the product does is it's really an intelligent calendar assistant that will basically block flexible time for the things you want to get done. And those things can be like routines. They could be a mix of personal and professional routines, things like, I want to exercise 3 times a week, but I'm okay doing it between these ranges, and it has this much flexibility. They can also be things like tasks, like I need to write an important document by the end of the week, and it needs to be on my calendar, or else I won't get the time, and I'll be doing it at night. We do a bunch of other things for your calendar. We can sync events from other calendars so that your availability is up to date. So if you've got like a doctor's appointment on your personal calendar and you don't want to get slammed with a meeting, which I'm sure has happened to both of you at one point in your career, and
very recently,
everybody at some point in their career. Simple problem, but big knock-on challenges around it. And there's a whole bunch of things that we do that I won't spend as much time speaking to, but probably the most recent thing that's really exciting is we've started extending that time blocking and automation from just like time for me to get my stuff done to time for me and another person to meet on a regular basis. And so now we have this concept called smart one-on-ones that automatically blocks time for 2 people. And I'd say the last thing I'll say, and I realize I'm talking a lot, the last thing I'll say is just that I think our one of the other realizations we had going into this space was that like time blocking isn't just hard because of the lack of automation or lack of software in the middle. It's also hard because things change all the time, and people need flexibility, and they need to be able to accommodate meetings. And so we try to do a lot in the product to give people time blocks that are negotiable. And I can speak more on that later, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I think what you've said so far should resonate very hard with our audience, in the sense that like, as a salesperson, so much of your day is taken up by like what you were talking about, meetings with other people, trying to balance heads down work. It's a bunch of different moving parts that theoretically every day isn't replicable. No 2 days are the same.
Right.
So finding a way to, as a salesperson who is responsible basically for their own success, managing a calendar so that they are maximizing the amount of time that they can use to be successful
Yeah.
is a thing that they should want. And I think like what you were talking about previously about managing the heads down time and a lot of what you're dedicating towards meeting that balance and striking that for salespeople is really, it should be on the nose for them.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And it's, it was probably one of the biggest surprises of building Reclaim was being product people, being sort of steeped in that world. Our thought was like, this is going to be most useful for product organizations because they're really, it's like salespeople, they just need to go and close the quarter and they're happy. But we've been really, despite having worked with a lot of salespeople and loving a lot of our sales colleagues and having lots of kind of good vibes with them, we were really ignorant, I think, around how universal of a challenge this is and how, the problem you described of like, you have a set of goals and that set of goals is sort of there no matter what. Like the organization expects you to do A, B, and C because it's their OKRs or it's the quarterly goal or whatever it is. But there's this debt that everyone has to go pay down. It's like we all have to go pay the piper before we get to before we get to eat our dessert, right? And that results in people pushing a lot of that important work to the points of their day that are actually supposed to be for spending time with their families or not working, which is a totally foreign concept to a lot of people. And so it's a really universal problem, I think, that you're describing, and especially in the dawn of remote work, I think it's become even more challenging for people.
Oh yeah, I can safely say, shamefully, that there have been days since I can work at home where 6:30 rolls around, and I'm up at my desk still typing away, and I get a text message from my wife being like, "Hey, you ever gonna finish?" Or like, "What's going on here?" It's like, oh, that's right. You just lose yourself. It's so easy.
Totally. Yep. Yeah, the boundaries are gone.
So how do you strike a healthy balance between knowing that you have to do things that you have to do to be successful and managing sort of the other component of time management and that you have to deal with other people? Because I think if you just eliminated, like, if I could just do heads down work, you'd be fine. Or if I could just meet with other people, I'd be fine. But theoretically, it's not possible. So
there are very few roles. Actually, there's quite a few roles in the organization. They're called engineers, and they are the one class of people I would say that I remember working with an engineering team, and I put a meeting on their calendar, and I showed up to the meeting, and there was nobody there, and I was like, "Why is there nobody here?" And they all pinged me, and I like pinged them. I'm like, "Hey, what's going on? Like, why aren't you here?" They're like, "Oh, did you invite us to something? Did you send us a Slack?" It's like, and they're like, "Oh, hold on, I've never logged into my calendar before. I don't know how this works." And so there's like, I mean, seriously, it's a bit of a crazy extreme example, but there are people in the organization who don't have that requirement foisted upon them. Their goal is to sit and make things for most of their day, and their obligations to meetings are pretty minimal, and that tax they have to pay is pretty minimal. There are exceptions to that. There are key engineers, people who are in every meeting and want to get pulled into every project, and we all know those people in organizations. But generally speaking, it's middle managers, salespeople, customer-facing roles. They don't have that luxury. So I think there's really like two components to it, which our product tries to help with, or really, I'd say three components. The first component is you have to be able to get ahead. If you look at most people's calendars, 3-4 weeks out, busy people's calendars, 60% is what our data bears out on average is consumed with recurring events, which is kind of nutty if you think about it. So it's like built-in debt, right? Like 3 weeks out, you're already down to like 40% of your week is available for you to do other stuff. So you have to get ahead of it. And that's really challenging for people because the further out you go into the future, the less predictability you have and the less you want your calendar to be rigid. You kind of want to have some flexibility as you go out further. So people will do this thing. They'll sit down on Sunday nights and they'll block out their calendar and they'll come in on Monday morning and feel great about it. And it all goes to shit by like Monday afternoon. It's like they've got meeting invites and people asking them for their time. And now they're like stressed out, and it's easy to burn out on that process. So the first key is you really have to get ahead of it. And that requires planning ahead. The second thing is you have to be able to be adaptive. And that goes to kind of the first point, which is, things are going to change. You're going to have new meetings, you're going to have new priorities, and you need to have a system that's flexible enough that when that happens, you don't like fall to pieces and your plan doesn't completely fall apart. And then the third thing is you kind of need to be able to convey to people, ideally asynchronously, when things are negotiable and when they're not. And that's one of the big challenges you'll hear about with time blocking is people will put down the dreaded 4 hour busy block. Mm-hmm. Someone looks at that and understandably, they're kind of like, is that for email or is
that for
all
4 of those hours?
Is that for something really important? And so context is one of the things that we also think a lot about. And our product really, like in a nutshell, tries to codify all 3 of those components by, number one, blocking time ahead of time. So kind of getting ahead of your schedule in a way dynamically that you just can't do in a scalable way. You can do it maybe at a point in time, but 5 minutes later, it's out of sync. We try to make your calendar more adaptive by responding to meeting invites. So meeting comes in, it interrupts your exercise habit, you accept it, we move your exercise to the next best time that we can see. So little things that just kind of make your day a little easier. And then that third component around being sort of communicating context and communicating what's negotiable, we make very heavy use of a feature in Google Calendar and actually in all calendar platforms that most people don't know about or don't use ever because it's not particularly useful unless you have something automating it. And that's this concept of free and busy events. You've probably seen them if you've ever created like an all-day event in Google Calendar. Those things default to free because Google, in their infinite wisdom, knew that you didn't want to have your whole day blocked out if you put a birthday down or something. It's more like a reminder. But when you put down events on your calendar, by default, they show as busy. What Reclaim does is it kind of watches your calendar in real time, and it's sort of running simulations to try to understand like, how much flexibility do you have to get this thing done? And if the answer is like tons of flexibility, it's 10 a.m. and you've got 3 hours in the afternoon where you could eat lunch and you only need 30 minutes. Reclaim's going to put that event down, but it's actually going to mark it as free. And what that means is that when people go to look at your calendar, that time's still available. So you actually maximize your availability. But as we see that time compress, we mark that thing as busy and we'll make it public and we'll put a little description on it that says, this is the last time slot that Henry has to eat lunch. So please don't take it. And so we're trying to communicate almost in the way a great assistant would, like context around what you're doing and why it matters, and also context around your availability. This is a free and open slot. You don't really need to worry about overbooking it, and it's opaque from other people's perspectives. Or no, you're kind of fighting for Henry's last few minutes. Like, please don't do that. Yeah. So those are the 3 things we've got lots more to do on it, but that's really how I think about dealing with that tax and how we think about our role in trying to help with it.
Yeah, 100%. And those are all really helpful strategies and ideas to even just think about as I look at my own calendar, I see all the recurring meetings. Like, as you said that, I kind of clicked through my own calendar. I was like, oh, that's a lot of recurring meetings. Maybe I should do something about that, right? I want to kind of dive into this concept of like, when is a good time, when is a bad time, but from a somewhat different angle, talking about the idea of golden hours. So in revenue generating positions, right? Like the best time to call prospects, or the best time to, if it's not revenue generating, the best time to maybe make a strategic plan, or really time you need to do something that you really have to put your mind to and sit down about. So this idea of golden hours, and when you're going to be the most productive, is that something that you think should work in there as well? Like, so I know I work better before lunch. Like, are those things I set there more important than things I set for after lunch? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, we have, you can almost think of it in terms of like, I think of it in terms of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There's foundational things that if you don't do them, your day is going to suck. And for many people, there's universal things like if my email inbox is completely full by the end of the day, that's kind of stressful. Or if it's full going on 2-3 days, that's really, really stressful.
You're speaking directly to me right now.
So that's a thing that some people like to set aside time for. Lunch is another example. Some people get really cranky when they don't eat for 12 hours
now
straight.
You're speaking to me.
Yeah, you're really speaking to me.
Can be bad. But then there's other kinds of things that are more like personal and professional needs. Like I have a habit in Reclaim that is to take our dog to the park in the mornings. And I have it set to like the highest level of defense that I can give it in Reclaim, because I know that if we don't get Charlie out to run around, he's going to go nuts the whole day. And that's just going to like throw my whole day off. So that's like, There's a baseline set of needs that have to be satisfied every day in order for people to just like have the foundation for being productive. And then, yeah, there's this kind of concept of like, yeah, when are you best? Not only when are you best in being, hyper productive around like deep strategic work that's going to take multiple hours, but when are you most productive at doing the busy work, the catching up on the emails, the updating your records in Salesforce, the sending, Slack messages to your team? Like, when are you most productive doing those things? When are you most productive doing deep focused work? And then when are you most productive in meetings? That last one, you get less of a say in, although we're trying to shift some of that with one-on-ones, because part of the idea is that you can both set ranges that work for you, and Reclaim kind of finds the overlap and tries to kind of meet both of your needs. But I think the idea of like golden hours is really about like understanding those kind of three categories of time, collaborative time, deep focus time, and sort of shallow work time in Cal Newport's terms. The challenge is that like everything else, is always shifting. Some mornings you wake up and maybe that is your normal, most productive time of the day, but maybe you slept really terribly last night, or you woke up and you got an email that really bummed you out, or you got whatever, something happened that caused you to lose that time. And so again, this goes back to the point of being adaptive. Like, you have to be able to say like, yeah, that would have been the time. And either I'm just going to declare bankruptcy and say like, I'm not doing that today, I'm going to do it later. Or you say like, I'm going to adapt my plan and I'm going to like instead spend these 30 minutes on some busy work, which will kind of get me back into the groove and hopefully get me back into a state where I can be productive. And the other thing, this is something that research has seemingly borne out every 10 years, we come to this conclusion and basically do nothing about it. But the number of productive hours in a day is very, very low. I think Toby Lutke is the CEO of Shopify, said it really well. He was like, if we could get 2 hours out of every employee every day for deep productive work, we considered that like a win, which is like, Americans hear that and they're like,
yeah, like 25% of your day. Are you kidding me? Like,
but you can think on your own kind of day. Some days you're crushing it. You just go and get into a mode where it's like, oh my God, I did all of those 2-hour periods in one day. But there's those days of just, you have to spend time thinking about stuff and figuring stuff out. And humans are emotional and they've got personal lives and they're trying to balance all of this, all these stressors, particularly these days. So yeah, having a concept of golden hours is really important, but more than anything, I think the important thing is to know directionally what those periods are for you and know when you need to adapt them.
Yeah, I think that like to that point, everyone kind of understands when and where they would be most productive. But like to your point, there are so many variables in there that like it's impossible to fully predict. And personally, I think that if you just are of the opinion that you're going to have to roll with the punches, it becomes a whole lot easier to actually do it rather than like what you were saying earlier, like being so rigid in your schedule that if something falls apart, you fall apart. Because that's going to just talk about 25% of your day being productive. If you have a 0% day, that's going to harm you pretty significantly.
Yeah, feels bad.
Yeah. We've talked about a lot of things that I think on a surface level, people listening to this podcast will understand. Like if you're a salesperson, you understand that your time is valuable to you in the sense that if you can do revenue generating activities to make yourself successful, then you want to block aside the time to be able to do that. Everyone gets that. But what are we maybe like not thinking of when it comes to the act of time blocking and really effective time management skills for specifically salespeople, that just like if you aren't in this world, you aren't considering and might still be impacting you in some capacity?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that people tend to kind of fall into. So the first we'll call them sort of cardinal sins of time blocking. The first cardinal sin is the 4-hour busy block. I'm going to block out my calendar, but not earmark it for something. It's very tempting to do that because I think we all have to-do lists and we can look at our to-do list and say, well, I'll just fill it with this stuff.
I'll just do all these things, right?
Yeah, right. And it's amazing how bad we are, especially like you got to think in the context of your day. It's like you're going from a meeting that may have been a great meeting, but may have been a real bummer of a meeting for some number of reasons, right? The potential downgrade, your manager is ripping you a new one, whatever it is. And you come out of that meeting and you've got this 4-hour block of time now, and you're supposed to like decide how to divide that up. Your brain kind of does this thing. There's a great article about it. I need to find it again. I think it was a study that was done by UMass Amherst, but it was about multitasking and context switching. And it describes kind of this period of time. It's almost like an incubation period where if you don't have like intentional sort of ideas of what you want to do with literally the next like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, your brain kind of has to go through this process of like, and you've probably experienced it yourself, where you jump to one thing for 5 minutes, and you jump to another thing for 5 minutes, and you jump to another thing for 5 minutes, and you're exhausted by the end of it because you're like now more stressed and kind of discombobulated. So being intentional almost to a ridiculous extent, I think, is really important when it comes to time blocking on your calendar, because having like a roadmap for your day, even if your plans change, even if you decide I'm not going to do that thing, I'm going to do this thing, it gives you a sense of like, here's where my time is going. Here's exactly what I plan to do with this chunk of time. And you can look back at that time range and say like, did I hit my goal? And you can literally look at your day before on the calendar and be like, did I hit my goals? Did I spend my time the way I wanted to? It's easy to check things off on a to-do list and write things in a to-do list, but really setting aside time to do intentional work, I think, is a big part of it. So don't do the 4-hour busy block, because you'll have a bad time. The other piece I think that we tend to not think about is estimation. Is another thing that humans are colossally bad at. It's part of the reason, speaking of engineers again, that engineering teams don't even do estimation, which is it's a little bit of a bonkers concept. And in some ways we're sort of trying to change some of that concept with some of the integrations we're building. But, engineering teams tend to think of things in terms of like t-shirt sizes. This thing's a small, this thing's a medium, this thing's a large. Some teams don't do estimation at all. Some of them will use like Fibonacci numbers and other fancier ways of doing t-shirt sizing, just to be nerdier, I suppose. But the fundamental part of it is just that like, when you start working on something, you learn something. And as you learn something, the scope of what you're working on changes. And as the scope of what you're working on changes, the time estimate changes. And so I guess the other piece of advice is like really thinking about, obviously you want a system where you can kind of get ahead of what's there and sort of be predictive. And that's a big part of what we try to do with our product. But we also really encourage users to really remain within their day, because you're going to learn something as you start working on a project. And so even just blocking like an hour for something that you're like, this might take me an hour, it might also take me like 8 hours. It really depends on how terrible it is when I get to it, or how challenging it is when I get to it. I think that's the other piece, is really trying to not be too like fine-grained or fine-tuned about how you spend every single minute, but to really think of it in terms of like, I have these priorities, I intend to spend this much time, and be open to the idea that like something you thought might take an hour might take 4 hours. And, those are also the moments where you can stop and say, is this worth spending 3 more hours on, or should I shift gears to something else? But at least then you can get yourself to a good stopping point and not feel like you're earmarking too much time, or not earmarking, quite enough time.
Yeah. And
I was going to say, I will say that I've fallen into that trap many times where like I'll start something and you take almost like a sample or bite-sized chunk out of the task, and then realize that you've either dug yourself a much deeper hole than you anticipated, or if it's great, you've actually been able to accomplish a lot more than you've expected. And that does shift your calendar for the rest of the day. And that feeling of, in some cases, dread or elation, depending on how long that task actually took, is either very bad or very good. And it's almost like magnified by how bad you were at estimating the time.
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing I think that's really shifted about the way we think about time estimation is due dates are just kind of fake at this point. I mean, it's not to say that there are some departments, like finance has to close the quarter by a certain date, or else the IRS gets mad, or the SEC gets mad.
And even
sales,
then, you can probably coast it.
You can coast it a little bit, right? Yeah, you can file late. The sales team certainly has a quarter date where they're going to report earnings, and there's a quota, and those are real due dates. But in terms of like day to day, week to week due dates, like it's all kind of, we're all doing a form of knowledge work now that is very like, what do they call it? Flexible date, negotiable scope, right? It's like the date might change and the scope might change, and therefore like we really don't need to like understand that this thing takes 21.3 hours to do. And so that's a challenging world to be in, because everything's both really urgent and also like not that urgent.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's really important to ground yourself in like, these are my priorities and I intend to spend roughly this much time on it. And as long as you're grounded in your priorities, you really can't go wrong.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that was interesting that you sort of touched on is, right, you have to be flexible in any work environment. We talked about that, but you have to set boundaries around that, because like you said, the sort of discombobulation example you gave spoke to me, because I'm on Slack all the time. People just send me messages constantly. It's part of my job. I enjoy it. But if I'm in the middle of something that maybe I've hit a roadblock with, and Slack, I can answer that quickly. Immediately my brain's like, let me do that. I don't want to sit here and work when I could just, right? So being able to set those boundaries, whether it's through something like Reclaim, or if you can just do it yourself, but be able to say like, no, that message will still be there in 15, 30 minutes. It'll be fine. But being able to set those boundaries around the flexibility is, I think, something you sort of keyed in on with those examples that I just think was really important to point out.
Yeah, and I mean, the other piece is the cost of that context switch. I mean, beyond just multitasking not being an ideal way to finish the work we want to finish, the same study, I'll try to dig it up if you want to link it to your viewers, but I'll see if I can find the article, talked about like an actual time cost associated with context switching, that for every time we switch context, we lose some number of minutes of productivity, because there's the cost of winding your brain down from thing A and moving to thing B. Then there's the cost of thing B back to thing A. And then there's some of the cognitive exhaustion that comes with that. And so, there's, being adaptable does not mean, I think sometimes workplaces and teams will use that as an excuse for like, well, we just need to be more adaptive, which means you need to do 15 things at once. I think we need to recognize, both as employers and as employees, that like, the human brain was meant to kind of hold at most one or two things at a time. And we're human creatures, and we basically need to be able to focus on things. And that doesn't mean, you have a totally rigid plan and you can't change courses. But if you're changing courses every 5 minutes, unless you're doing like Pomodoros and you're being really intentional about how you do it, I don't think that's a great pattern to fall into either.
It's funny you mentioned multitasking, and it just triggered me to remember, like, didn't we write about this at some point? I just looked it up. We literally wrote a blog back in like 2018 titled SDR multitasking techniques. Pro tip, don't do it. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. We've talked about this in the past.
Nice. OG multitasking. OG anti-multitasking.
Yeah, I was gonna say, but you looking that up was kind of multitasking.
I'm multitasking. I know. I've fallen into the trap. I set myself up.
And I wrote that blog, so.
Oh, man. All right. Well, I'll just be quiet for the next 25 minutes.
So one of the things I did want to point out and talk about is the fact that everyone sort of, I guess you could say, starts their time management journey in different places, or has their different strategies that maybe they've picked up bits and pieces here and there, maybe from different frameworks like Pomodoro. Maybe they just like I just have a list on a piece of paper that I've started using, and like that works for me. So I was wondering if there's any way to sort of relate what we've talked to today to the differences and journeys that everyone is sort of going through as they're figuring out how to manage their own time.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think that the thing that I think people can get really caught up in is the number of ways to skin the same cat. I mean, ultimately, and I feel very bad for that cat, but ultimately the mechanism that you actually use to be productive, I don't think is nearly as important as like, what are the fundamentals that are underlying that productivity? The very first version of Reclaim that we built was this really silly little prototype. It wasn't the very first version, it was like probably V2. And we had users enter in, name their 3 to 5 top priorities. And we didn't like deeply define what priorities meant. We just were like, let's see what people put in here. And then we had them map them to their calendar events using like keyboard shortcuts. And the idea was to produce analytics on like, where is your calendar relative to your priorities? We were pretty shocked. I mean, with some pretty like smart, highly capable, highly successful product people, how kind of much it catches people off guard.
Mm.
They either respond with tasks because in their brain they're like, oh yeah, I gotta, I'm being a little unfair here, but I gotta send an email to John, and I gotta, write this thing, and and those aren't really priorities that help to guide your work. They're more just like tasks you gotta do. And then you'd get these really aspirational ones like build a great product, which is useful as a grounding for your just general professional success, but it's not going to help you make trade-offs or make decisions. And so getting yourself to getting to a place, and I think it's particularly important in sales where you're literally thinking somewhat quarter to quarter, is like articulating what are my priorities, what are my key priorities over the next, let's say 2 to 3 months. I'm being a little arbitrary there, but like not so long, not so far out that they're useless, but not so close in that they're like too tactical. And I think that if you can ground yourself in those things and really understand what those priorities are and align the work that you're doing every day to that work, use whatever methodology you want, right? Like use Pomodoro. If that's the way you like to break up your work and that's the way you find yourself to be most productive, do that. If the best way is I make a big list of all the tasks associated with those priorities and I stack rank them from 1 to 10, and I do number 1 first and number 10 last, that's great too. That was my first time management productivity technique that my stepdad taught me when I was like, 13, 14. And so it's there's Eat the Frog, there's GTD, there's Indistractable, there's like all these like millions of techniques. And I think people get really bogged down in that stuff. And I think when you abstract away all of those techniques, they're really just a means to one end, which is it still takes a person doing some kind of tough work of like, really understanding and internalizing and stating their top priorities, and then thinking about the work that has to go in to make those things successful. So that's kind of the way I think of it is, don't get too hung up on a methodology because what works today may not work tomorrow. But the thing that I think has been pretty tried and true in almost every kind of, management job I've had or being managed by anyone is grounding yourself in your priorities and really thinking about the major objectives you need to accomplish and using that as a guide for how you block time, I think is the most important thing.
Makes a lot of sense. I think there's a strong parallel you can draw with salespeople in that there are, at this point, probably 10,000 different sales methodologies like BANT and MEDDIC and ADA and whatever. And like they all get shoved down your throat and you're trying to adopt all of them at once and at the same time, none of them at once.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think a lot of people find themselves to be successful when they're like, let me just do the thing that works for me. Yeah. And like, yes, maybe it's a weird component of a bunch of different ones that you've cobbled together, but like it's your own thing. And that's the big takeaway that I got from what you were talking about was like, you can adopt any time management technique that exists out there. And if it isn't going to work for you, then it will just not work for you. You can't fit the square peg into the round hole. So it's a matter of building the right peg to use for your own technique.
Yeah, and I mean, you gave me a little bit of post-traumatic stress when you mentioned MEDDIC, because I was thinking about all the sales kickoffs I went to where they were rolling out like sales methodology of the year. This year, we're going to do it this way. New sales ops person, new
2018
awesome
was so
process.
different, guys.
There's
Why would
only
we ever
13
use
steps
ADA?
in this thing. You only have to, you're 40% qualified if you're on step 4. And it's, and ultimately what's underlying, again, like, it's like, if you abstract away all those methodologies, it's like what? I understand your customer, build a relationship with them, sell the value of the product, don't get into feature function battles. Like there's like a million sort of like pieces of advice that find their way into all of those methodologies.
Right.
And people are looking for kind of a silver bullet in the form of a process, but ultimately like humans are humans. And if humans aren't grounding themselves in the things that are important, it doesn't really matter what the process is.
Humans are humans might be the best way to end a podcast I've ever heard of in my life. No, this was great, Henry. Thank you so much for hopping on and talking with us about systems, processes, time management techniques. And our audience is definitely going to learn a thing or two about how they can better structure and manage their own day to make sure that they themselves are the most successful versions of who they can be. If people do want to learn more about you, about Reclaim.ai, and just kind of dig a bit deeper into what we talked about today, where can they find you online?
Where you can find me online. You can find me on Twitter at @na_serious.
Get out of here.
I mostly tweet about I mostly tweet about rap and motorcycles, so it's gonna be one of those two things, and calendars, quite a bit of calendaring as well.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of my day job. On LinkedIn, I'm just my Judeo-Christian name, Henry Shapiro, and then you can learn more about Reclaim at Reclaim.ai, RECLAIM.ai. We've got a great blog there. We publish lots of great content about time management and different types of time management and calendaring productivity techniques. And you can sign up for the product and try it out for yourself.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you again for hopping on. Really appreciate it. Alex, any last words for the people out there before we sign off?
All I want to say is that AJ's been using Reclaim a little bit, and it's made it easier for me to schedule time on his calendar. So
amazing.
Give it a shot.
Shameless plug.
Amazing. We in a weird kind of way, it does. It's something we've actually heard from people that like it almost makes it a little too easy for people to kind of occupy some of your time, but. Hopefully, AJ, you're still getting to.
I was going to say maybe I have to rethink this whole thing.
You didn't get that 6 hour. You didn't get that 6 hour meeting invite from me. No.
Yeah, that was that might have fallen through the cracks.
Yeah, oddly, that one got deleted. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, must have lost my invite.
Oops.
Yeah, well, it's great to talk with you guys. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here again.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, until next time, everyone. Have a good one.